Word identification in middle school texts are difficult for many students because they have not had instruction about how to break down words into chunks, or some know how to break it down but are embarrassed or anxious to read in front of the class. Students will then completely omit the words they do not know or will wait until someone says the word for them. Another reason is because teachers will read to the student who is struggling, thinking they are helping when really the practice they need to become better has now been done for them. Discussing the three text complexity that can create problems for middle school readers is one, quantitative dimensions. Qualitative dimensions and task considerations can cause problems for middle school readers. Quantitative dimensions can cause problems because of word length, new vocabulary terms, and text cohesions. In the example, it displayed an elementary text and a middle school text. Both talked about the same information, however, the middle school excerpt did not contain a photo with the text. It was condensed and had unfamiliar words, potentially for students. If that little snippet of text is confusing for a student, imagine how they would feel reading the unit like they said. It would feel overwhelming, frustrating, and completely confusing. As for qualitative dimensions, content text use academic language, have more specific content terminology, students need to have more in-depth informational processing, and it is more abstract with the need of background knowledge. With all of this, students have a harder time understanding and comprehending. Task considerations include maturity level, cognitive abilities, motivation, and life experiences. Teachers need to understand the why behind their own choices of text for students and the purpose. If you are to choose a specific text, then understand where your students are through small groups to check for understanding for the text chosen. For possible sentences, step 1, teacher, select unfamiliar and familiar words. This is where a teacher will choose 4 to 6 words that are familiar to students and 6 to 8 words that are unfamiliar to students. The words that are familiar are to help students use their existing knowledge to help with the unfamiliar words. While going over these words, teachers should use the definitions that the dictionary provides, but also student-friendly definitions for students to understand the definition in terms that make more sense to them. Step 2, teacher and students practice word identifications. The teacher will create a list that are all mixed between familiar and unfamiliar words, and with these, the teaching of each word shouldn't be long and should be taught with confidence to not confuse your students and disengage them, especially the ones who need the instruction the most. Step 3, generate student-friendly definitions. Once the teacher has selected familiar and unfamiliar words, the teacher can then ask students if they know what any word means, and for any words they cannot define, the teachers then can provide student-friendly definitions for the rest. After this, the teacher can then ask students to predict how the terms can be relevant to the content. That will help students to anticipate how the words will be used when learning about the unit or topic. Step 4, compose possible sentences. This step is to ask students to compose sentences using at least 2 vocabulary words in each. This will allow students to think about the content when they read the text. Before students do this on their own, the teacher will need to model how to come up with a sentence. And once students understand, you can then have students work in small groups or a partner to write their sentences down. After the students are complete, the teacher can bring the class back together and have students share what they wrote. You can then write it on the board and share until all the words have been used at least once. Step 5, read text. Once the students have been shared and talked about, the students read the target passage. The students can do this alone, in groups, or a whole group setting. As students read, the teacher should guide them to look at how the terms are used to present content. Step 6, evaluate, discuss, and revise sentences. After they have completed steps 1 through 5, they will then be able to check for accuracy. It does not have to be word for word with what the author said. However, as long as it is along the same lines, that's what's most important. If the sentence is incorrect, they will need to rewrite the sentence so long as it still contains 2 words. When rewriting, students need to go back to the information in the text to reflect on the words used. This will help students to choose a close reading of the text. This helps solidify students' newfound vocabulary knowledge by discussing as a group to check for understanding to see if they wrote the correct sentence. If they did not, they are able to go back to the text, reflect, and revise their sentences to gain a better knowledge of vocabulary words. For the anticipation reading guide, the teacher reviews the materials and points out concepts. The teacher then writes a few statements about the principles, and for some students it can be helpful to focus on various controversial topics. However, teachers should be careful to avert from certain topics that are politically or emotionally charged within the school or even the community, like it said. Because there are true-false statements, it should be phrased as opinions. Statements that lack one right answer can lead students to cite different kinds of information in either agreement or disagreement. And because of this, guides can be referred to as opinionaires. If that is the case, these statements are put in the first column of the anticipation reading guide. So before reading, students identify personal perspective about the statements. The reason is for students to think about some of the text key concepts and how their perspectives might differ from the concepts presented in it or from the perspective of a fictional character. Conversing about this before reading will allow students background knowledge and prior experiences shape the understanding about concepts or beliefs about certain issues. For this first step, they will consider each of the statements teachers wrote and decide whether they agree or disagree by placing a check mark in the correct column. Students will then write a reason for their answer in the reader's perspective before reading column, and the teacher will need to model knowledge and experiences to write their reasoning. After modeling, students can then document their perspective independently. During reading, read, document textual evidence, and consider multiple perspectives. For this step, the students will read the text several times if needed. They will identify textual evidence that supports or refutes the statements written by the teachers on the anticipation reading guide. And lastly, quote or paraphrase the textual evidence, which will then need to include page numbers in the column labeled textual evidence. After reading, consider whether the textual evidence warrants modifying or qualifying one's perspective. And for this step, the students will be able to review their initial perspectives about the statements, decide whether they still have the same perspective or if they want to change their perspective. If students change, they will write an X over their checkmark and then write a new checkmark under their new perspective. The X serves as a visual reminder that information from the text influenced their understanding. After that, they will write a reason for their final perspective in the column Reader's Perspective after reading. If they did or did not change their perspective, students should still fill out that final column of the guide. Requiring the use of textual evidence is important to developing students' reading comprehension, as that reading comprehension has various skills, including the ability to cite textual evidence and to consider multiple perspectives. Students have a deeper understanding of a text rather than when they just focus on general impressions or surface level facts. Students need to learn from what they've read to analyze their personal perspective with one or more authors. Awareness of perspective supports middle school students by the readers' and authors' perspectives influencing reading comprehension. And while opinion responses are sometimes based on the student's own viewpoint, effective readers must also be able to recognize and evaluate differing perspectives. As students progress through middle grades, college and career standards emphasize the development of perspective-taking skills and the ability to consider multiple viewpoints.